Chapter 3. It had been weeks since I last left the apartment for anything other than Bruno's nature call. It was a process to even do that. Not knowing if anyone in the building was sick, I always put on a surgical mask and gloves before leaving. Afterward, I discarded the gloves and masks, then wiped Bruno down with a sanitizing wipe. Since it was such a process, I limited taking him outside to twice a day. At one point, I considered abandoning the cleaning routine since I never saw anyone on my walks, especially after a mandatory curfew was established in an effort to control the spike in crime. The news had become increasingly vague on details about my surrounding area. Most of the channels had other programs running over time slots that normally had my favorite anchorman. As a matter of fact, most networks had nothing but public service messages explaining how to best avoid the contagion, as well as instructions about the new curfew. With nothing to watch, I spent my nights at first shooting out my neighbor's holiday lights with a pellet gun I had bought the previous year. In what I only could imagine was an effort to cheer up the neighborhood, he went above and beyond setting up unsightly decorations, ranging from oversized turkeys and pumpkins to trees with excessively bright-colored floodlights to illuminate his landscaping. Most of his lights shined away from my window, but in order for him to keep guessing who was shooting out his lights, I always got a few random extra ones as well. The right thing would have been to just hang a sheet over my window to block the lights, but this solution was more satisfying. After a while, he stopped replacing the bulbs, and I was presented with the challenge of finding something else to do to pass the hours. It hadn't taken as long as I thought it would to read through the mountain of books from the library. It's amazing how much I could read when I had nothing better to do with my time. Even the dry medical books I grabbed were preferable to sitting in silence in my apartment. I was getting desperate and resorting to extremely tedious tasks to keep myself occupied. I organized my hangers in my closet, keeping the wood ones on the left and plastic on the right. I worked on my resume, adding the time I worked with John as a laborer. I organized my keys on my keychain, the first key being my truck key, followed by the key to the entrance of my building, then the mailbox key, and lastly, the key to my apartment. I lined up all my remaining cans of food by keeping the veggies separate from the soup, and so on. I managed to complete a jigsaw puzzle upside down, and I even dug out an old train set that I had when I was a kid and set it up for the first time in years. I had enough track to send it all around my apartment. When I was done, the locomotive only made it a couple feet before Bruno chased it down and destroyed it. Bad dog. When I was digging through my closet, I found some sky lanterns that I bought for a friend's kids but never got around to delivering. So, every night, Bruno and I put one together, wrote a note on it, lit it, and sent it out my window. If the wind was right, it took a while for it to slowly float out of view. Then I spent the rest of the night fighting the temptation to set off the rest of them. Beyond that, I spent countless hours staring out my window at the streets below. They were mostly deserted now. I just figured people at this point had long since barricaded themselves in their houses. The only movement was the occasional shadow of someone sneaking around under the cover of the night, long after curfew. For those people, options were few. They were forced to venture out, most likely looting and gathering whatever they could find in deserted houses. The weeks that had passed as I watched the world rot away confined to my apartment seemed like an eternity. At first, the flu spread slowly across the country. For a while, it seemed like we could beat the virus, the containment measures holding it at bay. But eventually, it just became too much to handle. Inevitably, someone would break past quarantined areas. The authorities did their best to isolate cities and towns with cases of it, setting up ever-widening rings of containment areas. At the same time, they were thinning out their personnel and other resources. I had watched so much coverage of the plague that I felt like I was an expert on the subject. No, they have it all wrong, Bruno," I yelled at a panel of doctors in various fields, giving their opinions on the outbreak from their comfy, isolated studio. When all the monosaccharides in a polysaccharide are the same, then they're called a homopolysaccharide. These monosaccharides are clearly different types. Obviously, that would make them heteropolysaccharides. Sometimes I shudder when I hear these guys talk. What a jack donkey. The host of the show thanked the doctor being interviewed, then moved on to the next one in the panel of experts. Dr. Sneller, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to take a moment with us. The more informed people are, the less chance of contagion, which ultimately means less work for us. In your opinion, are the containment measures working? The host asked a well-collected woman. Unfortunately, they are a necessary evil. The best and easiest way to deal with a catastrophe such as this is to prevent as many people from getting sick as possible. Prevention and containment avert contraction, followed closely by death. That is why we have limited the movement of people, despite being terribly inconvenient. In the end, the containment is for the greater good. But won't some people slip in or out of the nets you dropped on the various towns and cities around the country? That is always a possibility, but remember that these areas are locked down for a reason. If the disease is contracted, there is a long period where a carrier will be contagious but show no symptoms. Just think of how many people we have come in contact with so far today. That's how this virus has spread so quickly, exponential growth. And of course, once a fever and the other symptoms set in, the damage has already been done. We have determined that for every one person showing symptoms, 4 others have been infected. So, if one person breaks out of the contained area, that one sick person becomes 4. 4 becomes 16, 16 becomes 64, and so on. Growth like that will quickly overwhelm our already strained team of medical staff working around the clock to deal with this situation. So, in the face of those numbers, speed is our number one priority. We are doing all we can to determine if we can vaccinate against it. But to be honest, the data we have collected will likely be scrutinized for decades to come. Not since the Spanish flu have we seen anything like this. Cities where people live shoulder to shoulder are breeding grounds for pathogens such as this one. That's why anyone breaking the quarantine will be dealt with severely. It only takes one sick person not abiding by these precautions to undermine everything we have done to stop it. Do you agree with the steps being taken by the National Guard to contain it? The host asked. No, the doctor responded pointedly. I don't think they're doing enough. The number of cases we are seeing are reassuring only in that we are slowing the spread. But as I said, we are only at the beginning of this pandemic. So if you think a curfew or shutting down roads and restraining people's movement is bad, just give it a few weeks and see how fast it spreads without those containment measures. This is a map of the country, obviously, but the infected areas highlighted here are where we were roughly 2 months ago. Dr. Sneller pointed to a map with roughly a quarter of it shaded in red. I know there have been objections to our methods of containment, but this is where we're at now. The previous map was replaced with one that showed a strong third, covered in patches of red. Despite all we have done, we just don't have the resources to guarantee no one leaves their quarantine zone. It is imperative that we get cooperation from the communities. You could tell that she was more than stating a fact. She was pleading with listeners. I studied the map and spotted my hometown deep in the highlighted section, far from any areas that were considered safe. It's hard to say if it's better to know that you live in an infected area and take precautions, or in a presumably safe area and not take any. Safe just meant no reported cases as of yet, not that there wouldn't be any. We've dispatched teams of medical staff and emergency provisions to various towns and cities to care for the sick, but desperate people can often be hard to reason with. I clicked through the rest of the channels, all of which just aired their specific perspective of the outbreak, just as they did with the events in China. At first, the government denied or downplayed the flu and acted too slowly to contain it. In the end, they only helped it. This year was an election year. The current administration seemed more interested in keeping their jobs than they did about doing much else. His opponents used the way he handled the pandemic as a weapon against the president and the election. In campaign ads, they showed victims of the flu spread out in dirty warehouses waiting to die. In response, the president's political party downplayed the situation by saying, "Don't worry, it's only the flu," or "The worst is behind us." Meanwhile, the death toll doubled or tripled. When it came time for the president's political party to have a rally, they threw one of the largest, most elaborate ones this country ever saw, despite warnings of the spread of infection. As a result, 5 days later, the hospitals were full of patients, all experiencing the same symptoms. One TV newscaster tried to make light of the situation by saying, "It was one of the longest conga lines in history. ... cough, followed by a succession of body bags out the back and on military trucks." It was in poor taste, and he was never on the air again. A call went out for volunteers to help out with the sick. At first, people with good intentions showed up eager to help, but inevitably, the flu slipped into the army of overworked volunteers and did its damage through the ranks until the volunteers were added to the growing number of casualties. There was a phone number to call when you were sick. If someone died, a sanitation team assisted in the disposal of family members. Usually, if the flu worked its way into someone's house, there was usually more than one sick person. It became too much for a team to go to each individual house, so the authorities provided red flags to hang in front of an infected person's house. Every couple of days, trucks made their rounds through subdivisions and collected any of the deceased, not unlike when the bubonic plague terrorized England in the 1300s. Of all the horrible jobs in the world, that one had to rank somewhere at the top of the list. There was a popular rumor going around that the virus was spread through dogs. This caused people to put down their dogs in fear of them bringing the disease into their houses. "Hey, there's an idea," I blurted out to Bruno as we sat on the couch getting our daily update. "That's one way I could get rid of you." Bruno just lifted his head and stared at me with his big, unenthusiastic eyes. He let out a snort, then lowered his head, clearly not convinced I was serious in my threat. "You're right. Who else would I have to talk to then?" I said as I turned off the TV. "I've heard enough of that to last a lifetime." The only thing on at this point was coverage of the sick. The virus was everywhere, and every other illness was eclipsed by its reach. When someone in a house was sick, no one needed an additional explanation. It had been weeks since Aaron called me for my usual update. The last time I had spoken with him, he sounded worried and mentioned that their supplies were getting low. They were considering venturing out to find some more, despite my warnings. They didn't have much of a choice. Since then, I had been unable to get a hold of him or anyone else at his house. My own supplies were also getting low, so I would soon be faced with some of the same hard decisions. It was surprising how fast Bruno and I were able to eat most everything that I had stored up, even with rationing it all out. My mountain of food was reduced to just what I could fit into my cabinets. The trash outside was filled with empty soup and veggie cans. When I had bought all the food, I remembered thinking all this would blow over in a matter of weeks. At the time, I felt silly buying as much food as I did. Now, I didn't know why I hadn't bought more. If anything, conditions had gotten worse in weeks that had passed, with more cases of the flu across the country, including my town. Those who didn't get sick were staying in their own houses, doing their best to wait things out. There was a short period of time when everyone shared and tried to help each other. But just as Dennis predicted, it didn't take long for things to become very cutthroat and dangerous once the food was scarce. For most people, it was adapt or starve. I started to realize that staying in my apartment was no longer a possibility. Again, I wondered what other options I had. It seemed to spread sporadically, little red rashes on the map of the country that grew and spread until their outlines overlapped. I searched the couch cushions and dug out my tablet. Recently, I downloaded an app that tracked new cases of the flu throughout the country. As the app updated its data, an image appeared on the screen, an image of the virus as seen under a microscope. If I didn't know any better, I'd think I was looking at a picture of cotton balls, nothing more. It bothered me that somehow this simple organism was so small, so unremarkable looking, yet it was so deadly. A master infiltrator, capable of making endless copies of itself and causing the host body to act in a way that increased its chances of spreading, whether it was left on a doorknob, transmitted in a kiss to a loved one, or through the air to a perfect stranger. It killed without purpose, conscience, or prejudice, only because it could. It was designed to do so through trial and error via countless versions before it. This simple thing wasn't the first of its kind, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The app's map matched the one that was on display behind the panel of doctors on the news program. The denser the population in a specific area, the darker the shade of red. I zoomed in on my little town, highlighted, of course, in red, and studied the various roads out of town, all of which were monitored by the National Guard. The map also showed the different curfew times and municipality populations. As I had done countless times before, I tried to find a path out of the infected zone with the least checkpoints, trying to imagine how I could talk or sneak my way past them without getting caught. And as before, I closed the app in frustration and dropped the tablet on the couch next to me. I got up and started pacing in my living room, feeling like a caged animal. Bruno's eyes tracked me as I walked around the small space. I was irritated with myself for not making a run for it earlier. But how could I have known where it would be safe? When I decided to sit tight in my apartment, there weren't any signs of the virus in my area. It could have just as easily remained free of infection while the rest of the country dealt with outbreak. My self-inflicted isolation was really starting to get to me, yet it was the isolation itself that would keep me safe. I had no faith in the development of a vaccine. Contracting the virus was too big of a risk, a death sentence. Very few people got sick and survived to tell about it. That left me with one option: to wait it out. But the question still hung in the air around me. How long would it be? We could just drive through people's lawns and farm fields until we get out, I said indifferently. But what if we just walked it? I plopped back down on the couch and opened up the tracker app again. I zoomed in on my town and tried to plot a course to avoid as many actual roads as possible. And again, my heart sank. Realistically, the safe zone was just too far to walk without being spotted or picked up by the authorities. One thing was for certain: I wouldn't last much longer in my apartment. What if I could get to a place that was isolated, free from people, where I could stay long-term? I scanned the map again. Between my town and the next, there were various farms. They were very likely self-sufficient, as most farmers I knew grew their own food, raised their own cattle and chickens, and only really went to the grocery store for other necessities. But they weren't really isolated. They were still relatively close to their neighbors, and I doubted they would treat unwelcome guests kindly. As I widened my search past the farms and the surrounding towns, that familiar feeling of hopelessness started to creep back, until I spotted the large plot of uninhabited state land that bordered my Uncle Saul's estate and was along the coast to the east. It was deep in the infected zone, but the highlighted area was light pink, meaning very thinly populated. The only section of red was a small town a few miles from Saul's house, smaller than the town I lived in, but still much more isolated. The only problem was that I hadn't spoken with Saul in years. Shortly after I left, his wife was killed in a car accident, and Saul became a shut-in. Since then, he hadn't contacted me or answered any of my calls or letters. And I didn't even know if he still owned the property, but if he did, it was a place where I could feed myself by hunting. It had fields peppered with apple trees that always attracted game, as well as a river that was good for fishing. The problem was that it was a 5-hour drive on a good day. I zoomed out on the map and scanned the route. There were still checkpoints to deal with, which made driving out of the question. Anyone who tried to get around the roadblocks were placed under arrest and hauled away. At least, that's what the news reports indicated. But it was much closer than the safe zone. There were patrols at night by National Guard troops, but lately they had the reputation for being thugs who mostly looked out for one another. From what I gathered, they were just as bad as any raiders I could bump into at night. Even they were victims of the food shortage and lack of supplies. One thing was clear. If I was going to make it out of town, I couldn't drive or travel during the day. I had to disappear into the woods and stay out of sight. It would take a few weeks or more for me to hike as far north as I needed to go, and I didn't have the supplies to make that kind of a trip on foot, nor would I be likely to make it without being seen or caught. However, I did have enough to make it to the coast. Scanning the map again, I zoomed in on the marinas next to the harbor. They were highlighted in a deep red, indicating a high saturation of people with the virus. Growing up so close to the water, I often went sailing with friends. With all the local races and events, everyone either had a boat or a friend with a boat. However, the water was notorious for being dangerous. I usually only went out when conditions were perfect. Every summer, I heard about fishing boats that went missing, never to be seen again. But if I was going to make it that far up north without being seen, taking a boat was my best bet. I started to get anxious as I studied the path I would need to follow to get to the coast. For the most part, it seemed like I could stay out of sight and just maybe slip through unnoticed. But still, it was late in the season, and in any normal year, the sailboats that were normally kept on buoys would be placed in their cradles in storage by now. However, making sure people's toys were safely put away for winter probably wasn't high on the priority list these days. And some of the marinas might have a few sailboats in the water from die-hard sailors who liked autumn sailing. Either way, one thing was for sure, there wouldn't be many, if any, boats left. There was still a risk of being picked up by the Coast Guard. I certainly wasn't the first one to have the idea of trying to slip through undetected with a boat, but those people were mostly picked up outside of the safe zone. The infected area was patrolled, but the news reported that the Navy was concentrating its efforts more on the safe zone. Even they couldn't monitor the entire coast and stop every person who braved open water with a canoe. But staying close to shore and not attempting to leave the infected area just might go unnoticed. Another problem was that the closer I got to the coast, the denser the population, making it more likely that I would be seen or caught. I would have to head a little north of the city, then backtrack south down the shore at the bottom of the bluffs, keeping myself as hidden as possible. The bright side to this was that if I couldn't get a boat, I could still head north, keeping to the shore the whole way. But that would take a lot longer. I would not have enough food, and it would force me to find more supplies. With my new plan in mind, I decided sooner was better than later. Immediately, I shot up off the couch, went into my spare bedroom, and started grabbing potential assets for my journey. Bruno wandered in lazily as I ransacked my closet, tossing out any gear that looked like it might be useful. He claimed a corner in the room with a good vantage point, circling once before lying back down to watch the show. When I was done, I stood over the pile and dug out my backpack. I opened up the well-worn, much-loved bag and tipped it upside down. I paused a moment as a steady stream of sand poured out onto my floor. I tried to remember where I had last used it. Unable to come up with an answer, I hurriedly started ruling out the unnecessary stuff in the pile so I could make way for essentials. When someone is confined to carrying everything on his back, nothing must go into his bag unless it's absolutely necessary. I didn't want it to be so heavy that I couldn't make good time. I set out the gear on my bed, organizing it and rolling my clothes so they would pack as tightly as possible to save on space. I put it all into my bag, keeping items I would need along the way, such as the binoculars and my water bottle, on top, and stuff like clothes, the tent, and the water purifier toward the bottom. The few clothes I packed, I rolled up into tight little tubes, putting them in the bag first, followed by my little tent and a small stash of dehydrated hiking food. All I really needed was enough supplies to make it to my destination. Anything else would do nothing but slow me down. When I left my uncle's, I had left most of my clothes there, in case things didn't work out and I had to return. Hopefully, it all would still be there. I grabbed the duffel bag and packed what I had left of my collection of canned soup, beans, and carrots. After piling the remainder of it on my kitchen table, I noticed it was shockingly less than I originally thought. I only had about enough canned goods for a week before I would be fighting Bruno for his. If I was going to try to find safety up north, I had to leave soon. I shuddered when I thought about sleeping outside in the cold, so I dug around in the bottom of the closet for a while before finally pulling out my cold weather sleeping bag. Bruno immediately buried his nose in it, sucking in every bit of its scent. I too gave it a sniff and cringed at its musty smell. I must have forgotten to wash it, I confessed to Bruno as I stuffed it into a compression sack to reduce it to a dense ball. Well, it'll have to do. It's not like I have a warmer one. I added it to the pack without another thought and looked around the room for the rest of my camping gear. When I was done packing all my bags, they were slightly heavier than I wanted, but I was as prepared as I thought I could be for a 30-mile hike, after which I hoped to be rewarded with safe passage up north, followed by yet another hike to my destination. Bruno made himself comfortable on a pile of dirty laundry in a corner of the room. He rested his large head on dirty socks that were in urgent need of being washed. Long, drawn-out snores came from the laundry pile in the corner where Bruno had made himself comfortable. His large head was buried deep in dirty socks. "Just try and think of it as an extended backpacking trip, Bruno," I told him. His eyes remained closed, but his ears perked up at the sound of his name. In fact, I was the one who had doubts about my new plan. As far as Bruno was concerned, he would be going on a long walk. I considered what challenges I might face once I left the safety of the apartment. I told myself I would do everything in my power to avoid contact with people I might encounter along the way. Since Bruno's owners never did come and get him, he was my responsibility and would have to come with. I couldn't just leave him at my apartment to starve. Besides, at night, he would be an asset, seeing that dogs had an average body temperature of about 101 degrees, something I learned from my cheerful nightly reading about infectious diseases and the vermin who spread them. His extra heat would be an asset. As late in the year as it was, it meant that the high of the day would be in the 40s, and nights could possibly get close to freezing. It could take 2 days to get to the coast, and that meant that I would have to find a safe place to sleep during the day. When his owners dropped Bruno off, they brought his toys, bowls, and an extra leash in a dog backpack. He usually went with them on camping and hiking trips. He was more than happy to go along rather than sit in a dog kennel, so they got him a backpack to carry his own stuff. It would be no different with this trip. He would be responsible for his own gear. I unloaded his pack and arranged it with the essentials for him to make the trip. Even though it was not needed, I included his favorite ball. I added the remainder of his food, as well as his collapsible bowls. With my bags packed and ready, I reached for the finishing touch, an almost forgotten long black case under my bed. I unsnapped the silver clips, lifted the lid, and pulled out the rifle. I never hunted, nor did I ever think there would be a time when I would need such a gun to survive. I did always have a small fascination with them, and finally one day broke down and bought one. It was funny to me when the clerk at the gun store asked, "What do you need it for?" I didn't need it. It was just a frivolous purchase. The guy who sold it to me assured me that if aliens ever attacked us or we had a zombie apocalypse, I'd be set. He had referred to it as a sporty gun, not for the serious hunter, but reliable and tough. Once I got home and pulled it out of the case to familiarize myself with it, suddenly there were second thoughts about owning it. When I was in the store, it didn't occur to me that it was the same gun being shown on the news. Anytime they showed police footage of a raid or war, it was present in the hands of one or both sides of the conflict. I never did go to the range more than a few times shortly after I bought it. It had been so long since I had fired it, I'd forgotten where the bullets were. They weren't in my closet, under the mountain of dirty laundry, under my bed, or in the hallway closet. After rearranging the spare bedroom, practically ransacking it, I remembered I had hidden them in the kitchen cabinets above my sink, just in case someone broke into my place. The bullets were stored in small cardboard boxes, hidden behind jars that had red labels marked "pickled eyeballs." Nobody in their right mind would even think of looking for anything of value in there. I popped the pins out of the rifle, separating the upper portion from the lower, then stuffed them into my pack. I had a suspicion I would be cursing the extra weight, but not the meals that the rifle would undoubtedly bring me. Bruno relocated next to the 2 packs on the floor, while I double-checked we had what we needed to make the trip. In normal circumstances, it was not that far of a hike, but a lot could go wrong between my apartment and my destination. When I was convinced I had prepared as well as I could for the trip, I piled our bags next to the door like I would the night before any other trip. But this time, it was different. This time I had a nagging feeling that it would be the last time I would see my apartment. It wasn't much, but it had been my home for the past 4 years, and it was like saying goodbye to a life I would never return to. I slowly walked around, memorizing every piece of furniture, every dent in the drywall, some of which I put in myself and others that were there when I moved in, and I remembered how I felt when I spent my first night here. It was the first place I ever lived in all by myself. This apartment was like a first car. Most people, whether they had money or not, always had a lemon for their first car. Despite the rust holes, or that it left the owner stranded on more than one occasion before they were finally able to upgrade, they always had very fond memories of it. I believed it was the sense of freedom that came along with it. This, however, faded quickly for me, because it also meant paying for gas and getting a job. The same was true with this apartment. It went hand in hand with not having to report back to someone about what time to be home. I felt lucky with my place, too. The guys I worked with had all kinds of horror stories about places they had lived in, about bars that smelled like French fry oil and were noisy from patrons below. Some even had colorful tales of roommates. Even though they experienced issues like that, few ever returned to their parents' house. As I finished burning the smells and textures of my home into my memory, I focused on my appearance. I had been in and out of my bathroom, but it had been a while since I actually really looked in the mirror. My beard was growing out and starting to itch. I had needed a haircut before I became a shut-in, but now it was so shaggy it was starting to resemble the hair of the men on the covers of romance novels. I remedied it with clippers I kept under my sink. But now, instead of romance novel hair, I had a hack job hairdo that looked like I did it myself. Not sure which one looked better. After cutting my hair and brushing my teeth, I prepared for one last short nap before my journey. The sun was high in the sky, and it was way too early to leave. If I left now, I would most likely be picked up by troops or caught skipping checkpoints. So, I closed my drapes and crawled into bed to get some rest. I set my alarm for 12 o'clock a.m. I figured it would be well after curfew and dark enough to slip out on the edges of town unnoticed. I sighed as Bruno walked once again into my room, determined to rob me of every bit of good sleep I would ever get. As I drifted off, I contemplated just letting him loose. Surely even he must have one, or possibly even 2 instincts left that he could survive on. After a few hours, my alarm woke me up. As the grogginess wore off, I remembered why I set it in the first place. Bruno always shot right out of bed once the alarm went off and ran to his water bowl. I could hear him slurping and his chain rattling on the side of the bowl, and as soon as that stopped, I got out of bed. For whatever reason, every time he drank water, he always had to run over by me and wipe his jowls on my pillow as he woke me up to face the day. I learned quickly to get up fast and avoid the face wash. Bruno flew in the room, checking to see if I was still sleeping. Disappointed, he just sat and watched me wipe my eyes, digging out the boogers that had accumulated during my nap. Jumping out of bed, I put on my dark green cargo pants, black hooded sweatshirt, and my favorite jacket that I had laid out. Picking a pair of shoes was crucial. Running shoes that were good for long treks, or the hiking boots that would last longer and give good support for rough terrain. I decided to go with the boots, because most of the area I was going to be walking over was marsh and farmland. Not much sense to wear shoes that were mostly only good for sidewalks and streets. Once I was all geared up with my pack on and Bruno at my side, I was finally ready to leave. I put my mask and gloves on, and gave a quick glance back at my home as I said goodbye. "There's nothing here we couldn't replace later if we had to," I said to Bruno as I pulled the door shut behind me. I wondered once more if I would ever see this place again. Halfway down the hall, I realized as I listened to Bruno's heavy sniffs and snorts of disapproval that I hadn't heard my neighbors in a while. That, compounding with the faint smell coming from their door, clued me into why that was. That wasn't old garbage I smelled. Once outside, I quietly made my way down the street, sticking to the shadows as much as possible and picking up the pace when I was out in the open. My building was near town, but it had a lot of fields behind it, and there was little chance of being picked up there. Eventually, I made it to the small path that went into the woods. It was not much more than a running trail, but it was dark, and it cut through the woods past the park, clear across to the other side of town. The troops who set up the roadblocks wouldn't be able to watch every street, and with them stretched so thin, they most likely weren't wasting any manpower on a small path. After a short jog, I was out of the well-lit area and slowed down to a pace that I could maintain for a long stretch. At night, the path was much quieter and darker than usual, especially with the curfew. Not that it mattered. People didn't leave their homes much anymore. The curfew was meant to cut down on looting and fights, but with a lack of supplies, the troops were the worst thing townspeople had to face. The path went on for a couple miles before it ran straight through a subdivision near the edge of town. It looked as it did any other night. The stars were out, and the trees on the sides of the path were rustling softly in the light breeze that brought much appreciated fresh, clean air. Bruno trotted back and forth, sniffing the ground. "This isn't the worst thing in the world. You could use the exercise. Don't think I didn't notice how soft you've been getting." Unaffected by my cutting remarks, Bruno stopped and intensely sniffed at a dead animal that he found absolutely fascinating. "Don't forget to brush your teeth when you're done with that." As I walked, I promised myself I'd be returning. All this was temporary. I thought about the reading I had done on other plagues and reassured myself that people had survived plagues in the past. Sure, they made their mark on history, but they always eventually either burned out or mutated into a version that was less lethal. "How far do you think we'll get before we turn back home?" I asked Bruno. "I'll bet we get less than 10 miles before we see supply trucks dropping off non-perishables to those who need it and tents set up for vaccinating people in highly populated areas." Suddenly, I had an urge to turn back to my apartment, back to my warm bed. "We could build card houses," I told Bruno excitedly. "I haven't done that since I was a kid. I'll bet if I collected all the decks of cards in my apartment, I probably have close to 12 decks total, most of which are from different vacation spots. My favorite, of course, is the one from Ireland. The trip itself I don't remember much of, but the pictures on the cards, I'm told, were places we visited. For some reason, they have a hint of Paddy's Irish whiskey on them, but for the life of me, I can't think why. Don't even ask me what I'm still doing with them. I guess I never could bring myself to." My reminiscing was interrupted by a smell, faint but distinct. A gut-wrenching stench that I had smelled earlier today, only this time it was carried on the breeze. The trees broke, and the path opened up as it passed over a street that ran through a small subdivision. The lawns were all overgrown. Trash was piled up at the end of each driveway. That also added to the collage of smells that tainted the night air, but more pronounced was the smell of something rotting inside the houses. Then I noticed it, hanging from every mailbox that lined the streets. Red flags, flapping in the wind, signaling the flu had reached the house. It was hung to both warn others to stay away, and worst of all, to register a death. The red flags were included in a packet of information that was sent out on how to steer clear of the plague, including minimum safe distances from other people, instructions about washing hands, and explanations on how the virus spread. It warned against the possibility of contracting the disease in crowds and discouraged gatherings of any kind. Some houses had other red items hanging from their mailboxes. As I walked, I noticed red ties, shirts, or rags dangling in the wind. There were signs that some of the houses were looted. Windows were broken, and doors kicked in by people desperate enough to chance getting the flu over the possibility of finding a meal. If people were that desperate, I wondered what they would do to me to get my gear. The hope I had that things would get better was stomped out at the sight of that subdivision, as were any thoughts of returning to my home. They were replaced with a hollow feeling. Once through it, I found myself picking up the pace, eager to get as much distance as possible between me and those houses. "The first chance I get, I'm going to take an acid shower with a steel brush," I declared to Bruno as he kept pace with me, also eager to get away. The little time I spent crossing the street and seeing that subdivision was enough to make me feel like I had a layer of grime on me. I reached for my mask and adjusted it on my face. It did nothing to block the smell that hung in the air. Every time I got to a point where the path crossed a street, I took my time looking both ways to make sure there weren't any patrol cars camped out around the corner. Bruno kept pace with me, and except for the occasional sniff at a suspicious bush or tree, he was always at my side. His heavy breathing and snorting kept me aware of where he was as I constantly scanned the woods and made sure we stayed out of sight. The path eventually ended at an old gas station by the woods that surrounded our little town. I continued straight into a cornfield. I thought of how every year the farmers had a competition cutting mazes into their fields. This year, however, we would have no such pleasantries. Most people would be more concerned with staying alive. The fields were not harvested, except for the locals who picked through them for whatever food they could get. At first, I tried to be as quiet as possible as I walked, but eventually I gave up and made a terrible ruckus stomping through the corn. There was a slight incline that seemed to go on forever until I reached another section of woods. The night passed quickly, much too quickly. I replayed the sight of that street over and over in my head as we walked, and before I knew it, a sliver of dawn peeked over the horizon. I decided to find a good place to set up camp in the woods and lay low for the rest of the day. Even though I was out of sight, it was out of the question to travel during the day and risk being spotted by some random patrol car as I crossed a street in the middle of nowhere. Besides, I had been walking all night long, and my best guess put me approaching the halfway point of my walk to the coast. I spotted a group of trees where I could set up my tent so that no one would see it unless they were really looking for it. I remembered liking the color when I bought the tent, but as I pulled the red shelter out of my backpack, I realized that the bright red material made it stand out amongst the green foliage. I made sure to find a spot where it would be surrounded by dense trees and began setting up my home for the night. The sun was up before I finished getting my tent up and gear rolled out. Before bedding down, I did one more walk around to make sure I could not be easily seen from any angle. It was considered a two-person tent, but really it was only big enough for one person and a little gear. Even though it was small, I still let Bruno in. The extra heat would be much needed. Once inside, I took off Bruno's pack and served him up a ration of his food. He didn't waste any time digging into it, as if he hadn't eaten in days. I had a delicious can of cold minestrone soup and a bottle of water to kill my hunger pains. I was going to try to stretch out my food as long as I could and eat the canned food first before even thinking about touching the light dehydrated food. The bag of canned food that I brought didn't seem very heavy at first, but over the 15 or so miles that we had just hiked, it was beginning to feel like I was dragging a boat anchor behind me. With that in mind, I decided to help myself to a second can. I justified it because I was starving, and it would reduce the weight of the duffel that much more. When I was done, I kicked off my boots, set them in the corner, and spread out my sleeping bag and pillow. I spent a few minutes spoiling Bruno by rubbing his ears and scratching his chin as he looked up at me with big, brown, trusting eyes. Just by looking back at him, I could tell he was just as tired as me. He lowered his square head on my lap. Within seconds, every time he blinked, his eyelids lingered shut a little longer until finally they stayed closed. "On the bright side," I said as he started to let out his snores, which would inevitably get louder as the day went on. "If things get bad enough, I can always eat you."